registration. And tonight, I'm actually recycling a talk I gave 7 years ago. I really like doing academic presentations in situ in the right places. I was invited by people in Warwick to come and talk about Walter Savage Landor, who was born in Warwick, which delighted me because my father was born in Warwick, and both of them died in Italy. So I put together the talk with slides, and I called it Warwick Seen in an Italian Frame, Walter Savage Landor and John Robert Glorney Bolton. And I've been several times using this as my way of beginning and ending a paper. Alcmaeon, Aristotle's physician, said, "We die because we do not join the end to the beginning." And I'm going to go to the next slide, which it always resists moving these slides. Okay. Okay, let's go to right. And then the next slide, we see the Ouroboros, which I'm going to, so I can see what's going on. And this is the serpent devouring its tail. It's an Egyptian hieroglyph. It's on one of our tombs. And it's absolutely fascinating. It denotes eternity. And in this talk, I shall talk about two men. One, Walter Savage Landor, the writer and poet. The other, my father, John Robert Glorney Bolton, also a writer, both born in Warwick, and who both ended their lives in Italy. Let me give you this talk as a keyhole in Rome, as an Italian frame for learning of these two Englishmen. Advance the slide. It's being obstinate. Okay, let's try that. Okay, next one. These are the two men I'm talking about. And then this on the Aventine Hill, and you can see all the tourists lining up. They're looking through the keyhole through which you can see St. Peter's. And I also have another slide where, looking through our iron gate, you can see the English cemetery. These senses of perspectives. And I'm using this as a way of learning of these two Englishmen from Warwickshire. Walter Savage Landor is buried in Florence's English cemetery, of which I'm custodian, alongside Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Arthur Hugh Clough, Thomas Southwood Smith, Frances Trollope, mother of Anthony. I think maybe these are some of the pictures of them. William Somerville, husband to Mary, while my father, Glorney Bolton, and brother Richard Rothwell Bolton are buried in Rome's Protestant cemetery with John Keats and Percy Bysshe Shelley. Okay, these are the people I was talking about. That's Frances Trollope, who wrote the first anti-slavery novel, Traveling Up the Mississippi to Cincinnati. And this is Mary Somerville, and she's responsible for the invention of our computer, working with Ada Lovelace, Lord Byron's daughter. We don't normally think of women as inventors of computers. And their lives span in time from the Regency and Romantic period to the modern day. And their geography includes Warwick, Wales, Spain, Italy, and India. This is this wonderful romantic image of Champollion and Rossellini with all of their loot in Egypt and Nubia that's in our oh, Angela Carmela, sorry. Welcome, Angela. Right. And we normally don't think of this as being a problem, but this painting is in the Museo Archeologico in Florence. This is the tomb for Rose Aylmer. Walter Savage Landor was from before Byron, who dates were 788, 1824. Shelley 1792, 18 to 22, and Keats 1795, 1821. He was born in 1775 and outlived them, dying in 1864. He was a romantic amongst the Victorians. Born here in this house, this is where I was actually talking about him, was in the house where he was born in Warwick. He grew up in Warwick and in the surrounding countryside, a brilliant and rebellious boy writing Latin poetry at Rugby, attending Trinity College at Oxford, being expelled from both places. He wrote exquisite classical quatrains, especially to women, all his life, to Ione, to Welsh Nancy Jones, who bore him a child, to Rose Aylmer, an earl's daughter, and this is the poem he wrote to her, and it's still on her tomb in India, both of whom he met in Wales, to Ianthe, to Irish Sophia Jane Swift, whom he met at Bath, and who married a cousin and later into French nobility. He continued to write fine letters and poems to Rose Aylmer's equally lovely niece and namesake, Rose Painter, to the end of his life. He published Jabir in 1798, a wonderful poem which plays off the book he borrowed from Rose Aylmer, an exotic telling of a Spanish prince who falls in love with an African queen, Carabar. I evoke his romantic atmosphere with his painting in Florence's. That was the painting of the Archaeological Museum of the expedition to Egypt and Nubia by Champollion Rossellini. Here are some of its lines. But I have sinuous shells of pearly hue within, and they that lustre have imbibed in the sun's palace porch, where when unyoked his chariot wheel stands midway in the wave, shake one and it awakens, then apply as polished lips to your attentive ear, and it remembers its august abodes and murmurs as the ocean there. In that same year of 1798, Rose Aylmer sailed to India with an aunt, dying there 2 years later of fever. Her tomb in Park Street Cemetery now having his lines, "Ah, what avails the sceptred race? Ah, what the form divine? What every virtue, every grace? Rose Aylmer, all were thine." Rose Aylmer, whom these wakeful eyes may weep but never see, a night of memories and of sighs I consecrate to thee. Coming into his inheritance, savage Landor decided to sell his Warwickshire property and buy Yantony Abbey in Wales, planting it with thousands of trees. But he got into difficulties feuding with his workers and tenants, and the project was largely a failure. Sorry, that's an ambulance going to Santa Maria Nuova. We'll let it pass. In 1808, at 33, he decided to go to Spain, fighting privately against Napoleon in the Peninsular Wars, but soon rebelled against Spanish politics and returned home to write the play Count Julian, set in Spain at the fall of the Visigoths. As a play, the work was unsuccessful. We remember that Napoleon would be finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, as a child, was taken by her parents to that battlefield immediately following the Battle of Waterloo. She never told Robert this because that would have given away her age, but she wrote about it in her epic poem, Aurora Leigh. The child there. Would you leave that child to wander in a battlefield and push his innocent smile against the guns, or even in the catacombs, his torch grown ragged in the fluttering air, and all the dark a mutter round him? Not a child. And here you see the woman responding to the idea of war, especially in connection with the trauma for children which I think reminds us now today of Ukraine. I was just watching the Russian film of Tolstoy's War and Peace. It's a brilliant film, but it's rather too topical. But Savage Landor needed a wife, all his muses having either died or married others. He proposed to a pretty but not very intelligent girl in Bath, the daughter of a bankrupt Swiss banker, Julia, and took her to Yantony Abbey, where they entertained the Coleridges. Debts mounted. The young couple took off for Italy, leaving the property to be managed by his mother and brother. After staying in various palaces in Florence, a friend acquired for them the Villa Gherardesca in San Domenico, where Fra Angelico had been prior. After the Landor family vacated the premises, they were acquired by the American professor at Cornell University, Daniel Willard Fisk, who carefully photographed the villa as it had been under Walter Savage Landor's care for it, and also photographed his own superb collection of Icelandic, and this will interest Philip Rauten, and Italian materials housed in a different place in Florence. These are now at Cornell. And I acquired these images from scholars in Iceland and at Cornell University in New York State, America. The Villa Landor is now the Scuola di Musica of Fiesole. Walter Savage Landor's marriage to Julia was a disaster. She bore him children, Arnold, Julia, Walter, and Charles, but she deeply sensed his greater love for Rose Aylmer, Rose Painter, Iole, and Ianthe, and also for men, for Walter Savage Landor was bisexual. She resented him deeply, herself having relations with other men, such as Trajan Wallace, who painted her portrait with her children, Arnold and Julia. She vented her rage against him publicly, to the point that he left his family, returning to England, especially to Bath, for many years. We learn of his visiting Warwick in 1845, dining at Guy's Cliff with the great scientist and mathematician Mary Somerville, being present, whom he admired greatly. Then again in 1853, at the age of 78, he spoke of the mulberry tree in the garden of Landor House, remembering it from 75 years earlier. And this is the house in which I was giving this talk. And he was writing a poem about it. Old mulberry, with all thy moss around, thy arms are shattered, but thy heart is sound. So then remember one for whom of yore thy tenderest boughs the crimson berry bore. Remember one who, trusting in thy strength, lay on the low and level branch full length. No strength had he at last to climb it now, nor strength to bear him if he had, as thou. And this mulberry survived until 1940. It was there when my father was growing up in Warwick, and even in my lifetime. But Savage Landor, we remember, had a savage temper as well as a heart of gold, and loved to wage war with satiric poetry that got him into deep trouble. In the end, attacking a rather horrible woman, he was forced to flee abroad. He returned to the bosom of his family in Florence, who rejected him again, his wife and his oldest son, Arnold, particularly making him unwelcome. He became homeless in the streets of Florence with a white mane of hair and beard like a mad King Lear, when the Brownings arranged lodgings with him for with their former servant, their maid Lily Wilson, who had accompanied the two eloping poets and Elizabeth's pet spaniel Flush 13 years earlier. Remember that Virginia Woolf wrote the biography of Flush. The first 2 summers, the Brownings took Walter with them to the countryside around Siena, where the young and beautiful American Kate Field studied Greek from him, and where he partly recovered from his senile dementia. But he was a trial to poor Lily Wilson when he went back to Florence, forever throwing his dinner out the window, tablecloth and all, in his rages. Kate described 55-year-old Elizabeth Barrett Browning's funeral in 1861, noting that everyone forgot to order a carriage for Walter to attend it. At the end, a very gay poet, Algernon Charles Swinburne, visited Walter, composing the lines now on his tombstone. Savage Landor's own burial occurred in 1864, 3 years later than Elizabeth's, his younger two sons, Walter and Charles, being present. His tombstone was so cheap that it had to be replaced by another slab in 1945. His cruel eldest son, Arnold, died probably of syphilis in 1871. That's the new tomb for Walter Savage Landor. And Julia had him buried as far away from his father as she could, with a life-size statue of herself, her back turned to her husband on their son's enormously expensive tomb. We brought the bones of Walter and Charles' son, Arnold Henry Savage Landor, the artist, inventor, writer, and explorer, to lie at their feet, reconciling all the branches of the family who came from America, Wales, and Italy to honor Walter Savage Landor with poetry and music. We have a ceremony in the cemetery of carrying the books of authors to their tombs, reading aloud the title page of the book, the inscription of the tomb, which we especially did on this occasion. And we have supposed descendants of Shakespeare and so forth. And it was a lovely occasion. But it was a bit scary when I read the death certificate of Arnold Henry Savage Landor. What had he died of? It was the very serious disease, extremely contagious. I forget what it's called. Remember, they were sending it in envelopes to members of Congress. Anthrax. That was a bit alarming. And then this is the library in the cemetery to which Jane Field's wonderful volumes of Walter Savage Landor's came. She gave them to us. She was the president of the Walter Savage Landor Society in Warwick. And also my father's books were here. The Lily Crosses, the Roma make copy of these from the Bodleian Library. Every Sunday here we used to hold alphabet school for the Roma families, gypsies from Romania, who came to Europe 1,000 years ago from India, who were slaves from the Middle Ages until the 19th century when they were freed by Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin being translated into Romanian, but who still have not had civil rights and schooling. It is they who restore the tombs and garden the cemetery. And now to speak of another writer born in Warwick who died in Italy, my father, John Robert Glorney Bolton. These are the Roma. This is my father writing in Rome. And I'm sorry the photograph has faded, but the room was beautiful with red walls like Pompeian architecture. His mother was from the Quaker caches of Coventry, and one of her ancestors was a friend of George Eliot. They both ran away as children trying to get to London. His father was from the Quaker Glorneys of Dublin. She was not allowed to marry him for many years, he being a poor Irish artist. Then the Quakers let them have the laid-down meeting house to live in, opposite the Earl of Leicester's hospital, shown also in my grandfather's paintings. This was founded by the Earl of Leicester at the time of Queen Elizabeth I, and it still has the almshouses for elderly soldiers. This is one of my grandfather's paintings of it. When my father was 5, he was the boy sacrificed by the Druids in the Warwick pageant my grandfather John Nunn Bolton produced with Louis Napoleon Parker for the Countess of Warwick in 1906. This was rather traumatic for my father. My grandfather also made the head of the dun cow brought onto the field breathing fire and smoke. Other episodes included the founding of the first school of Warwick, the oldest in England, and the story of the 8-year-old boy. This is the boy Shakespeare embracing Queen Elizabeth. John Nunn Bolton died just 3 years later of polio which also lamed my father. And this little boy who was in the part acting the role of Shakespeare, he was the the boy who was born in Warwick. He was killed in the First World War. My grandmother, who also died before I was born, was left a widow with 4 children to raise. My father, whom they called Robin, Eileen, Derek, and Joyce and Derek. She would mend the tapestries in Warwick Castle for her friend the Countess and embroider bishop's mitres to support her children while seeking scholarships for them. Eileen and Joyce both were artists like their father. These are Eileen Mary Bolton's Prince of Warwick, Derek and Frederick Rothwell Bolton. Derek Frederick Rothwell Bolton went to Cambridge University, became a dean of the Anglican Church of Ireland. My father, the oldest child, like Walter Savage Landor, and like him became a writer, but not a poet. As a boy, he sang solo in St. Mary's Church, then went away to Ardingly School, where they could hear the cannons booming from the battlefields during the Great War. All the cricket 11 died at the front, as also did the boy who acted Shakespeare in the pageant. Restless, reading Charles Lamb's essay on the Bodleian Library, a 14-year-old orphan, my father wrote to its librarian asking to work there, and arrived on the premises. He didn't finish his degree at Oxford, went first to Yorkshire to work as a journalist, 1923-1927, learning there of Sir James Roberts of Saltaire, then to India, where he covered Gandhi's Salt March for the Times of India, of which he was an editor 1927-1930. And he writes about this as being in the presence of history very quietly being made. His first book was The Tragedy of Gandhi, published while Gandhi was in prison. He met my mother, Sir James Roberts' granddaughter, first in Canada, she being also a journalist and writer. I was conceived in Geneva at the League of Nations while Europe was preparing for World War II. My parents dedicated their dual autobiography, and that's this book in the front, Two Lives Converge, to Julia. Like the marriage of Walter Savage Landor, my parents was also unhappy. I was sent at 16 to live with an aunt in America. My mother went to Canada, my father to Italy, where he worked for the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, and wrote several more books, including one of Pope John XXIII, his friend, then still alive. He died in Rome and was buried in the Protestant cemetery with John Keats and Percy Bysshe Shelley, Joseph Severn, and Richard Rothwell, who painted the portrait of Mary Shelley, my brother Richard Rothwell Bolton joining them there 10 years later. We buried my brother in Richard Rothwell's tomb that had, like that of Keats, been designed by Joseph Severn. Both Walter Savage Landor and my father loved gardens. Walter saying a garden should not be too neat. Savage Landor also had his great friend Ianthe plant from him 4 mimosa trees at San Domenico, where he had wished his tomb to be, later finding these had been cut down. I planted a mimosa tree by his tomb in Florence, it was a disaster because it grew so large we had to cut it down and turn. But these are images of the cemetery through time and of its garden, which we've now restored with the help of our Roma workers. And that's this photograph was actually taken by my father when he was writing his book on Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And this is the reason why I, as a medievalist, ended up also working with Elizabeth Barrett Browning to help him. I particularly love this quatrain of Walter Savage Landor's, which I would like to sculpt on stone and leave as a stone on the ground in the cemetery. Death stands above me, whispering low, I know not what into my ear. Of his strange language all I know is there is not a word of fear. And now for the final slide, which is, okay, these are the Roma restoring it. That's the rose called Julia, which is where I will be buried. These are the irises and the roses and so forth, and the lily. And now for our final slide, here is the Italian frame, the gatehouse of the English cemetery in Florence. And here is one of the wooden rocking cradles our Roma make with us for the project we call From Graves to Cradles. And here is the Ouroboros on an English tomb in Florence with which I began this talk. If we write books or even just give books, inscribing them with our name, in a way we do not die. We join ends to beginnings. We glimpse here and now the past, bringing it into the present. And I am here now with you, where I was in Walter Savage Landor's house 7 years ago, where Walter Savage Landor and John Robert Glorney Bolton were born, joining their ends to their beginnings. Thank you so very much. And I was so grateful that I got to Warwick and found that where my father had grown up was so beautiful. No wonder an Irish artist settled there to teach rich young ladies painting and to try to get commissions for portraits. There's a lovely story in my family. The Quakers were rather concerned about the improvident artists and who had married their relative. So they would commission their portraits, but they wouldn't take them home because that would have been vain. So when I was growing up, there were these portraits of these stern Quaker relatives hanging on our walls, which we've now lost all of them because of the way we've had to go into exile so many times. Right, now everybody unmute yourselves if you are muted. And it's time to talk. This is a much shorter talk than before. And probably not a very good idea that it got recycled. My apologies about that. But any comments, any questions, please? It's your turn. Yes, I can't hear you. Yes.
Julia, just about 2 or 3 days ago, I was watching a special on a BBC channel presented by the British actress Joanne Lumley.
She went to school with me.
Oh, she did. She did. Yes. She did a piece on the Protestant cemetery in Rome. It was a very
wonderful. Yes.
Yeah, it was wonderful, and she focused on the Keats and Shelley tombs, and also one with a weeping angel.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah.
That's William Wetmore's story for his wife. And Frederick Douglass got William Wetmore's story to do the tomb for Theodore Parker that's here. He was the abolitionist. That's wonderful, Phil. I didn't know that. Now I must write to her and tell her she's got to come and do one here.
Yeah, I think she would be great. She gets very poetic sometimes and very thoughtful. It's really, really nicely done.
Yes, yes. I mean, she acts some pretty crazy roles, but we did get a good education from the Anglican nuns. They were very learned nuns into Greek and Hebrew and so forth. And I think it rubbed off on us. But yes, thank you for telling me that. I must try to find it.
It's a 3-part series with, she does Paris, Berlin and Rome. I've only seen the Rome one, and it was really nice. So, yeah. Right,
because it would be lovely to get her to do it here, because we've got such splendid stories, and the people are so interesting. And I feel it's really
definitely.
Yes. Okay, somebody in chat. Let's see what that is. Right. Could you, Anya says, could you share the information on the BBC documentary?
Yeah, I'll try to find the title of it for you.
Was it BBC4 or what?
Well, we watch a channel here called BBC Brit. So, and I think it might actually have been on a Norwegian channel. So I'll have to look up the information.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Right. But it was really nicely done. Really nicely done.
Yes, that is a beautiful cemetery too. They both are.
And it's interesting, this Ouroboros. When I was at the Manuscript Institute in Reykjavik, one of the
Mm.
scholars there told me that when he was young, he found a ring that was shaped like this with a snake biting its own tail. Because I had mentioned that one of the characters in Laxness's novel, Iceland's Bell,
Mhm.
has a ring with a snake biting its own tail. And he said he found one when he was
Wow.
young. I
Yes.
said, where's this ring now? And he said, it's in a box in the basement of the National Museum.
Where did he find it?
Somewhere in the countryside. I think it was something very old. So I still, so one of these days, I need to go talk to the people at the National Museum and
Yes,
find
yes.
that. Yeah.
It's there's a rather sad Browning story. Robert was quite decent to Elizabeth at the beginning of their marriage, and he bought on the Ponte Vecchio a lovely gold ring with Florentine lilies for her, and it was given to Balliol College, and somebody stole it, so it's gone.
No.
And it's the ring that he talks about in The Ring in the Book, in his poem, where he has the husband murder his wife, and it's a bit awkward. That more comments from more people. Can I see? Let's see if we can find the.
I love this image of the snake biting its own tail.
Yes,
I mean, this is just an anecdote, but when I started out my studies in Göttingen of American literature, T.S. Eliot was thrown at me with the four quartets, but I remember even at that time, in the beginning is my end, that stood out so much.
yes, yes,
And
yes.
20 years old, I didn't quite understand that or could relate to that. It's a little different now, but it's such a beautiful phrase, and that brings us
Yes,
out so beautifully.
it is. Yes.
Thank you for sharing or giving me some insight on Julia Savage, Julia, because I was just there in the cemetery and I took a few pictures of that rather remarkable tombstone.
It
And I
is.
meant to ask you at the time, but I had already taken up so many hours of your time. And now you
Oh,
shed all that light. And I'm glad I didn't ask because you have a whole story, of course. Um, it's a remarkable statue.
it
I,
is. Every bubble observed. I mean, she's got this knit scarf. One shoe is shown. She's climbing up the stairs to kneel at her praying desk. It is so hypocritical. And it was so expensive. The sculptor
Mhm.
is Michele Autoripoma, who does a beautiful sculpture in the Porte Sante by San Miniato up above Florence of
Mhm.
two young girls, and they are playing together, dancing together, and the cloth around them is transparent, and he conveys that in the sculpting. It's just extraordinary. He was really, he in those two works, they were tour de force. But everyone is so much in love with this
Oh
particular
yeah,
sculpture,
it
and I
is. It
have
is.
to disillusion them about it. and, but it was wonderful when all of the family members came, because some of the descendants, they were twins who were both counts and one of them a general, terribly elegant, aristocratic Italians, after whom a cocktail had been named. And there they were. And at the same time, John Landor, who was a doctor, his ashes were being buried by his wife, and he was Anglican, and the other Landors were Catholic. So we had the Anglican priest side by side with the Catholic monk from San Miniato, who's a wonderful medievalist and my friend Don Bernardo. And when they arrived with the caskets with the bones for Arnold Savage Landor and so forth, and Arnold Landor, um, they'd forgotten to bring the papers. And luckily, we had the head of all of the cemeteries in Florence, and she said, "Don't worry about it, just go ahead." But then later, when I went to pick up the papers and I read anthrax, I was a bit alarmed.
Yeah.
Julia, are all of these stories written down?
Not that one. That one I've sort of kept quiet about. Yes. I don't want people alarmed. I do know that who died of tetanus and so forth. I've done the medical research into it, because that is extremely, well, it's very sad because so many children died of diphtheria. We are so fortunate. So many mothers died because they didn't know to wash their hands following childbirth. And that part is absolutely tragic. And we're going through a rather interesting episode right now, because Daniel has done the plaque for Sarah Parker Raymond, the African-American woman who studied medicine and became the first woman doctor here at Santa Maria Nuova Hospital, with a letter from Giuseppe Mazzini. She'd already been studying at All Saints and University of London, Bedford College. And she was a friend of Frederick Douglass. And I was explaining in my lecture at Santa Maria Nuova Hospital that the men were not washing their hands when they delivered babies. And the women were, the midwives were, but not the male doctors. So there was this vast discrepancy between the wards, and the poorer women survived and the rich women did not. And Domenico Chiara wrote about this, and he observed it in Parma. Semmelweis observed it in Hungary, and they were trying to persuade their male colleagues to change their practices. And there was a great deal of resistance to it. But we're also finding a bit of resistance to the fact that the plaque is sculpted by Daniel for Santa Maria Nuova Hospital. It's absolutely wonderful. Santa Maria Nuova Hospital understood, and they wanted, and they're going to place it by Monna Tessa's stele. She's the woman who founded the nursing order 700 years ago. She was Beatrice's nurse. So it just seemed right to have these two women pioneers together, even though 700 years and different continents. But the women who are sort of proposing this have taken it out of my hands, and they don't want a Roma having done the plaque. They don't realize how racist they're being. And it's a rather sticky moment, because the hospital understands, but the people who are being very generous about, saying we will go to the Belliati and persuade them, have come up with something very dry as dust and academic with tons of footnotes. And they're saying to me, but she died in Florence. And I'm saying, no, she was living in Rome. You had to bury the dead within 3 days in Roman, in Italian law. And I've seen where she was entered in the Protestant cemetery in Rome. I discovered it. And they don't want to believe me. And they're saying, well, you've got to find the death certificate. And I've been trying to get my father's death certificate, who died in Rome. But the Protestant cemetery in Rome is a kind of potter's field. You could only bury the dead at night, because the church did not want non-Catholics being buried or honored and so forth. And I don't know how to deal with this. They're also saying that she married conveniently an Italian in order to get her permesso di soggiorno. Well, we didn't have permesso di soggiorno back then, so it's a bit awkward. Joanna Lumley's Great Cities of the World, and Philip Broughton says he doesn't think it's a BBC series. So
It might be ITV or something like
okay, right.
that. But
So I think we need to do a Google search for Joanna Lumley, Great Cities of the World, and then see if we can track it down, and see if we can track her down to come here.
And get her to do Florence for sure.
Yes. Mhm. More
Julia?
comments? Yes.
Oh, this is
This
Sue.
is Sue, right?
Yeah, now I was thinking, I was asking, well, I am asking, if you have any commentary on your father's book of the tragedy of Gandhi, because your
Right.
son, Richard, told me that his grandfather was actually critiquing him or had some criticism of Gandhi, and I thought that
Right.
was interesting.
Okay, the first book that my father wrote, called The Tragedy of Gandhi, Gandhi was actually imprisoned during that time. And my father was part of the, the English community in India. But he changed, and in his next book, Peasant and Prince, he is pro-Gandhi. In the first book, it does criticize my father, for instance, had grown up as an orphan, and there was never enough money, and there was a lot of stress, and he despised poverty, and he couldn't understand Gandhi's espousal of poverty, nor could he understand Gandhi's masochism. He said that was a woman's tactic to allow oneself to suffer, to create a change in the oppressor. I wrote an essay critiquing my father on this, saying that actually Gandhi, his espousal of poverty and his espousal also of the satyagraha, was a very effective non-violent method of changing. And I can remember listening on the radio as an 8-year-old child when the declaration of India's independence was being made. So that was just, I was very pro Gandhi as a child. I would get so upset every time he'd be fasting and rush to my father and so forth. Yes, you're right about Richard saying that Richard is my son, and that my father was at the beginning critical of Gandhi. And then he understood. He was on the ship going back to England with Gandhi for the Congress meetings and so forth. He just was present at so much of the major events of Gandhi's life that he was able to write about them as a kind of primary source for history books since his time. Does that answer your question, Sue?
Thank you. Thank you. That really does. And he also told me they were kind of like, they were friends. If
That
that's
they
true,
were
but
kind of what?
like friends. They were friends.
Yes. Gandhi, in fact, when my father went to Gandhi's ashram to interview him for the Times of India, Gandhi played a joke on him and wrote a news account, which is on the web somewhere, about this blue-eyed, blonde-haired Englishman coming to the ashram, and Gandhi interviews my father. And Gandhi had a wonderful laugh, and he was capable of joking and so forth, and so was my father. And
So he turned the tables on him.
Yes, yes.
Funny.
Well, it was in friendship too, and equalizing, because the whole problem of India and the Raj in India. My father was shocked when he went, because one day he was going to take a train and he was late, and his bearer was saying, "You must come, Saab, you must come." My father was saying, "No, it's too late, the train's gone." And this poor bearer was saying, "No, Saab, you must come to the station." And my father was absolutely horrified. He finally went, and the whole train had waited for him because he was the white Saab. And this really horrified him, that there was this differentiation between the white Englishman and the Indian. And he was relieved with India's independence as well. More comments and questions?
I read just a couple days ago also about how George Washington complained about how the Quakers were helping the slaves move on the Underground Railroad.
Right, right,
The
yes,
slaves.
yes. Yes, Princeton, I was part of Princeton Quaker meeting, and the battlefield of Princeton is right outside the meeting house. And the Quakers were, you know, sort of treating both the English and the American soldiers, wounded soldiers alike, which was really annoying to the Americans and so forth. But there is that's which also in this period in the 19th century, you will have Henri Dunant, the Swiss, who travels through the battlefield and sees all of these wounded and dead. And he's so horrified at the inhumanity that he founds the Swiss Red Cross to treat both equally alike. I was listening to a very powerful talk on genocide this afternoon, where the scholar was saying that we only use genocide for the Holocaust, and we politicize the other massacres of civilians by saying they are parts of groups that are insurgents, for instance, in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Ukraine, and so forth. Whereas no one's talking about the Catholic teaching of just war, that you do not wage war against unarmed civilians. It was a very powerful talk pointing out how international law is actually permitting these mass deaths. And I think his argument was that we need to change that. More comments? And I wish we had the gallery. I don't know how to do the gallery. Okay, there we are. Right. And so Anya or Thelma?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We've missed not being able to come to Florence for the last 3 years. We'll hope to come next March.
Yes, yes. I loved it when you came. And you had the wonderful paper on the trollops.
That's right, yes.
That was splendid. That's on the web. And
Oh,
I've
yes.
used it again and again.
Oh, good.
And because, and do you know what I've discovered is that Joseph Garrow is the first person to have translated into English Dante's Vita Nova.
Ah, yes, yes, we need
It's
that.
brilliant.
Yes,
And it's a
yes.
lovely parallel text. And I ordered it from New Delhi in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and it arrived when poor Delhi was just having a ghastly time with COVID. Beautifully bound and exactly like the original edition. And so, and it costs only €17. It's a lovely addition to have in this library.
Good.
And he was the son of an Indian princess. And you've done, tell us more his story, please.
Well, yes, he was born in India. His father effectively married her. I don't suppose it was legal marriage according to the English, the Indian, and then he died when Joseph was quite young. Joseph came back to England and was looked after by an uncle's family who treated him extremely well and were obviously completely unworried by the fact that he had an Indian mother, and brought him up, and he was musical as well. And then he married Theodosia Garrow later. And I think he probably actually had two brothers who were instrumentalists. I think he may have met because he possibly had lessons of them. And then I've got my, you go on. They went to Italy.
Yes, they went to Italy when Theodosia,
Yes.
who was the singer, she died in quite advanced age, and her husband and his daughter and his other relations went to Italy. But I believe that when Theodosia Garrow, the one who was to marry Trollope, was living in Torquay,
Yes.
that he got to
She
know
knew Elizabeth Barrett Browning
Landor,
already.
Landor,
Yes.
and he encouraged her in her poetry and her writing.
Right. But the doctor came and took their inkwells away, saying that it was not good for their health to be writing poetry. Yes, because they both had TB, Theodosia and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and that was why they were convalescing in Torquay. And Joseph Garrow was actually a justice of the peace in Torquay, in Devon.
Yes.
And that's on his tombstone. We've got 5 Trollops in the cemetery. And we've got the maid, Elizabeth Shinner.
Yes.
We've got Harriet Theodosia, Theodosia's sister, half-sister. We've got Theodosia. We've got Francis Trollope. And we've got Joseph. It's amazing the collection that we have of them.
Yeah.
With Thomas Adolphus, who is not buried here, writing the Latin inscriptions on the tombs. And he does it rather interestingly. Was it Natus Somerset and so forth, and so on. But the Trollope Society is going to be coming. They did plan on coming, and then COVID happened. And they're going to be coming this coming fall. And we published together Francis Trollope's Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw with the drawings by Auguste Herveau, and the terrible drawing showing the treatment that they actually witnessed of the black slaves as they were journeying up the Mississippi. It's a very powerful novel. I prefer Fanny's writings to Antony's. I define her as Jane Austen with a heart of gold, vinegar and a heart of gold. And she's willing to take on social issues. She's willing to, she plays off other texts like Tartuffe, in The Vicar of Wrexhill. She talks about clergy abuse. And so forth. She talks about all the topical issues. And in Michael Armstrong, Factory Boy, against the use of children in mines and factories. I love the people buried here. They're the good sort. And your research on Joseph Garrow's marriage was extremely important. And I put on the web that painting of where the dead father, very elegant in the medallion, and then the little boy who's clearly not English, dark and very Indian featured, and then the aunt, who is again beautifully English. It's beautifully done. I've only got it in black and white, but there is a descendant of theirs who carries out all of the research on that family. And Theodosia's daughter married right into the top aristocracy.
That's right. But soon died, unfortunately. Died in childbirth, I think.
Yes.
Soon. The Thomas T.A. Trollope's novels set in Florence were interesting as well. Marietta, isn't it?
We're rather fond of Marietta, which is set in Florence.
Yes. Right, more comments? It's going to be a bit of a shorter meeting this time. I don't know what we should do next time. Should we talk about Sarah Parker Raymond? Or should I try the autobiography? Or what else? Suggestions from the floor? Philip?
Sarah Parker Raymond would be very interesting, I think.
Okay. Yes, she is interesting for the whole history of medicine, right? Okay, we'll work on that. And there's a
Thank you,
Finnish
Julia.
scholar
This
working
certainly
on
was
as
not.
well.
This was
Excuse
not
me?
a recycled. This was not a recycled talk for me. This was super interesting, Julia. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. This was great. It was
Thank
beautiful.
you. Thank you, all of you. Right. Okay. And Joanna Lumley, Great Cities of the World. We'll track that one down. Bless you, all of you. Okay. From a
Bye-bye.
very hot Florence. I'm
My daughter
envious.
left Florence today, Julia.
Ah, yes. Mhm. Did she
And,
enjoy it despite the heat?
Oh, she said well, actually, she left yesterday and took the bus to Rome.
Yes.
And she said she prefers Florence and she feels like she's stepping out of a dream.
Right. They are very different cities. I adored Rome when I was there. I was there 21 with my first child who spoke Italian before he spoke English. And Rome is very different from Florence, but I'm really glad I've ended up in Florence, which is so small, so dense with meaning.
That's what she said too.
Yeah, yes. And in Florence, one can actually do something about it, you know, to help it find more of its history again.
She said she was exhausted. She spent 5 hours at the Uffizi.
Yes.
And she said she went home to her apartment because most of the time she was at the art studio. I mean, that's all she did.
Mhm.
But she said she had to digest, and she said, "I only saw parts of it. I
Right, you
was
can't
so
see all of it. No.
exhausted." And she said,
Yes.
"How can people do this? Just walk through there with and not even understanding what they're looking at?" And she was very
Yes.
upset about that. And yeah, she's very much enamored with Florence, and I think we'll see her
Good.
back there, I'm sure. But it was so hot too. I don't know how you can stand it, Julia. It is so hot.
Yes, I know, right. Well, the Florentines all go away to the sea and the mountains in August. They never stay here. They're so intelligent. We're not. Mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the midday sun. My poor father in India with a topi and
Yes.
all of these problems
Yes.
with the prickly heat and so on and so forth. And I'm very worried about the climate change, and we've had violent wind come through the cemetery, knocked down one of the cypresses, and has messed up. We can restore them, but it's not easy. The tomb of the son of King William IV of England. And I've got to find the funds to pay for that. So, and I know you can't ask the royal family. They expect everyone else to pay, like the Swiss, which is why people become rich, because they don't pay out. So, okay. Bless all of you.
Thank you,
And
Julia.
good night.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Stay
Yes.
safe.
Okay. Right.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.